Hi everyone, I'm Jason Lim, the Chief of Staff at Australia's top tech and innovation hub, YBF. Today I'm talking to YBF's CEO, Farley Blackman, in a fireside chat called Patience Kills Innovation. He'll be talking about how to lead innovation with an action and ROI-based mindset. Farley, welcome to the chat.
Thanks, Jason. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you as well. Now, Farley, Patience Kills is quite a dramatic title. We've always been taught growing up that patience is a virtue. In the case of innovation, why is it actually a bad thing?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Patience is a virtue, and certainly it's a very, very important part of being a human. It's necessary, certainly, with family and friends. So I don't disagree with that. Where I think it becomes a challenge, quite honestly, is in the business world. And, it can be seen when companies or individuals get too complacent and really rely on the status quo, the successes of the past to influence the future. And when I say that patience kills and kills innovation specifically, it's really about that. It's really about not being patient with performance, not being patient with the successes that got you where you are today, and consistently challenging and looking for different ways, new ways, innovative ways to do things.
Now, Farley, you've been an executive at some very, very large international companies throughout your career and startups as well. Could you talk about how you've personally implemented a patience kills mindset to solve problems within these organizations?
Yeah, Jason, I'm not the most patient person in the world, as those around me would certainly know. So, being impatient, if you will, has come naturally for me. It might be a detriment in some aspects of daily life, but it's been certainly a strength in business. So, throughout my career, I really have consistently pushed and challenged and really been restless in my approach. So, for me, when I talk about complacency, restlessness, patience, those are all words related in the way that I look at business, in the way that I challenge, in the way that I innovate. It's not being complacent, it's not being patient, and it is being restless in all that we do. For an example, maybe I'll give you a fun one. So quite a long time ago, I worked on a movie called What About Bob, starring Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss. It was a really fun film. It was shot down in Virginia in the U.S. And one day on the set, there was a bunch of wood that was on the porch of the house where we were shooting. And it really wasn't a problem. It was not supposed to be there. But since the filming was all indoors for that day, there was no issue, and the day was going on fine. Now, movies are gobsmackingly expensive. Even if you look at them on a minute-by-minute basis, a lot of money. So if you have to shut down a picture, even for minutes or certainly for hours, the dollars just add up. And towards the end of the day, the decision was made to actually shoot on the front porch, to shoot outside. And all of a sudden, that pile of wood that wasn't supposed to be there became a problem. Now, movie sets or film production is really much like a big company. It's complex. It has a large number of specialists doing their jobs. And I think the intricacy about a film is that it happens over an abbreviated time. And you have really, really deep specialists with really, really tight contracts that tell them what they can do and what they can't do. So by the time we got to the filming on the porch, everybody on set had no responsibility to remove the wood. So everybody just looked at each other and said, well, it's not in my contract, I can't move the wood. And the folks that I guess could have moved the wood weren't there for one reason or another. Maybe they left for the day since it was late. And me and my team, I was a department head on the film, were there. And I had a decision to make. I had a decision that said I could just let it go, which is not really what I do, or I could jump in and do something and potentially ruffle a few feathers. So I made the decision quickly to grab one of my crew members. We went up there, we moved the 10 2x4s that were there, and the movie got on. Now, the interesting thing with this example is that I knew that likely I would get reprimanded or called out for doing someone else's job, even though they weren't there to do it. That's the nature of those sorts of arrangements. But I made the decision anyways, because ultimately it was a personal risk I took, and the worst that would happen is I would be scolded. And the best that would happen is that we're actually able to move on quickly. We're able to make a difference. We were able to save money, cut inefficiencies, and the film went on. So that's I guess a fun example of me not being patient, getting into action, doing something, and moving on.
Thanks, Farley. That's a great example. I haven't personally seen the movie, but did it end up doing well in the box office?
I don't know. I think so. I don't think it's one of the all-time greats, but it certainly was a fun movie. It was a great movie to work on. The crew was awesome, and the cast was great. So I have certainly fond memories of it, and it pops up on various cable or internet or streaming shows every once in a while, and my credits are in there as well. So all good. That's fun, awesome. and a neat part of my earlier life. So.
Sounds like a really interesting turn of careers for someone.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. So, Farley, that's a good lead into my next question. You mentioned before that some people on the set felt like it wasn't their job to actually move the wood. So, I guess, how does an organization instill a patience kills innovation virtue? And more specifically, what does leadership have to do to ensure that culture permeates through the entirety of the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jason. Firstly, a company relies on leaders and followers and ultimately a team. It's really, really important. Leadership certainly sets the tone, but if you set the tone and no one follows, then there is no culture and there is no need for patience or impatience because the company is going to fail. What happens over time, though, is that, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, is that the successes of the past influence the future unless you proactively look to challenge the status quo, to shake things up, to be impatient, to be restless. And there's a role for leaders. I mean, they need to reward, they need to lead by example, they need to show that, maybe it's a minute of celebration for successes, and then it's maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 times that time spent on thinking about, okay, what's next? What's the next success? What in our model needs to change in order for us to continue to be on the cutting edge? And you need to have followers and you need to have a team that accepts that kind of challenge. It's not easy. I mean, you ultimately need to, as a leader, be able to separate the person from the performance. And I think this is fundamentally important. You need to be patient with the person, you need to be patient with the individual, and you need to be impatient with the performance. Easier said than done, because over time the person and the performance kind of mold together, and you need to be able to put the person in one compartment and the performance in another, and figure out how to have a conversation, kind of maybe a two-way conversation, because Joe or Joanne could be a great guy or girl, and the performance could be good or bad. And I think you need to be able to have those conversations and separate the two. I'll be honest, it's not easy, and I've certainly failed on a number of times separating those things, because I'm naturally restless and naturally impatient and naturally looking for what is the next thing. I probably at times don't, step back and celebrate enough on all the wins and celebrate and separate the person out. And that's, again, why a team is so important, why it's so important to surround yourself with individuals that complement you. And as a leader, you really need to find folks that, if you're an impatient leader, a restless leader, then you need to find patient individuals to kind of soften things. And if you're a softer leader, then you probably need to find those that will interrogate the issues and shake things up and push and probe a bit more. And that's why a company is a team, not an individual.
Farley, you mentioned two words in there, followers and leaders. How do you define followers, good followers and good leaders?
Yeah, listen, It really depends on the company, and I think it depends on the leader. It really starts there, especially in the startup world. So, in the startup world, the idea to start something up usually comes from one or two people, maybe three working together. And they really need to think about what their strengths are. They need to look in and be honest, an honest reflection of what they're good at, what they're not good at. And they need to figure out what the team should be around them. And, I think followers and leaders are actually two sides of the same coin, because every leader needs to follow sometimes, and every follower needs to lead at some time. So it's really a question of putting the right ingredients, the right team together to deliver what your customers, your stakeholders, what the environment, what your, the community needs. And it's one of the hardest jobs, is actually putting the team together. And it's probably hard for a lot of people to really reflect on what makes them tick, what they're good at and what they're not. But unless you do that, you're probably going to end up with a team that looks a lot like the leader. And, that might be easier at first, but it's seldom successful. Diversity is absolutely and fundamentally key. And I'm not talking about diversity of, gender, ethnicity, which is also important, but I'm talking about diversity of mindset. I'm talking about the ability to push back, to get into a healthy and robust debate, to have healthy tension, so that ultimately the decision made is the right one. And I think that's probably another place that separates leaders and followers. Ultimately, the leader needs to make the decision, but he or she should be listening to those around him or her.
And Farley, the other word that stood out to me as you were talking previously was the word performance. How have you throughout your career defined performance?
Yeah, to me, it's simple. I mean, performance is over-delivering on your commitments. And, if you're only doing as, good as you're expected, then, maybe that's good enough for most things. It's probably good enough to keep the lights on. It's probably good enough where things aren't changing quickly. And, the neat thing about companies is actually it needs people with all sorts of skills and all sorts of abilities and all sorts of mindsets. If everybody was rushing towards innovation, if everybody was challenging the status quo, then the product you made that's successful probably wouldn't succeed because, everybody got bored with that and moved on to the next thing. That doesn't work either. And, what's great about, starting a small business or a startup and growing it is that over time you get to build a team and work with individuals that have a number of skill sets and a number of focuses and a number of places that they naturally feel comfortable in. Some of it is what I call lights on, keeping the lights on in the company, providing a consistent product or service. But as important, and in some businesses more important, is actually innovating that product and service. And it's when those two things come together, it's really magic.
Thanks, Farley. I want to talk now about the inverse of the examples you've given. Could you give an example of when patience has killed innovation at one of your previous companies? Or alternatively, do you have any examples, any anecdotal examples of this?
I think there needs to be that, what I call internal restlessness, that internal impatience. But you also need to figure out when that is the most appropriate thing to use and when it's not. So I think part of change is actually being impatient enough to challenge the status quo, slam the door open to opportunity and innovation, but then throttle back. Because ultimately, once you get the buy-in to drive the change that you want, the implementation is probably going to take you a heck of a lot longer than you want to do. Although you might be able to do it in a vacuum or in an academic sense in a month, it might be much more powerful to do it over 3 or 6 months. And that's where it's really, really important to be patient. So, I'll give you some examples, some really simple ones. So, when I was head of procurement for BP, we looked at the IT kit that we were buying. And at the time we were spending almost $2 billion a year on technology equipment alone with third parties. So not an insubstantial amount of money. And as we started to piece apart where that money was going, there was a fair amount of money being spent on kit. So whether that be laptops or, phones or data center equipment, et cetera. And a lot of the stuff at the time was single source. So that meant it was going to one vendor. So if you step into the world of laptops or notebooks, we were spending all our money with IBM, which is now Lenovo. And, there was a need to multi-source this, but what we found was that there was a lot of emotion. I mean, people liked their IBM Lenovo machines. And when we introduced Dell, there was extreme pushback. So what we needed to do was, state the business case, which was so obvious. I mean, it was, a lot of money, a lot of zeros saved every year, and ultimately getting the same exact functionality, especially for a machine that's going to be replaced every 2 or 3 years anyways. But, the decision's made. Do you then say, great, starting day one, you're going to just replace all the machines? Well, no, you need to actually think through a patient approach. And maybe you find the parts of the organization that are more accepting of moving away from IBM and accepting Dell and get them to go first so that others in the organization actually then say, okay, actually, the world didn't end and things are okay. And, something that might have taken, several months might end up being, a 1-year process. So you have to be patient, but you have to be restless and impatient to get into the conversation in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's all about finding that right balance of tension. And I suppose that's where leadership comes in, strong leadership, doesn't it?
It does. And it's leadership, and I'd say it's a risk profile as well. So, what appetite does the leader have for personal risk? And I think that's fundamentally important. So as a leader, if you're not willing to take the, I'll call it the virtual punch to the gut or the virtual black eye in order to make a tough decision, then you're probably not going to be the leader that drives change. You're probably not going to be the leader that fully innovates, because innovation's hard. People don't like change. I mean, just look at anything that you do in your personal or work life. If changing cereal or changing, TV providers, the one we have works. Why do we need to change? I mean, it's human nature not to change. So when you do it at a large scale, when you're impacting, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, and in the case of BP, hundreds of thousands of people, you can imagine the noise from the chorus that comes up and pushes hard. And if you don't have the profile to accept that, to take those virtual punches, then you're probably going to not get to the end.
Farley, you've worked in both startups and corporates throughout your career, and they're obviously very different beasts and very different machines. Do you think the way you approach this patience kills mindset is the same in a startup versus a corporate?
No, is the short answer. So, it really depends where you are in the startup. I mean, if you are the founder, you have a gift and you have an ability to set things up the way that they should be. That might not be the way that you want them to be. I mean, there are ample examples of startups that have, created a startup in the image of the founder, only to find out maybe the founder's values were a bit flawed and they needed to bring someone else in to fix them. So again, I'm going to repeat myself, but it starts with really knowing your strengths and understanding that there are others that need to help. When I left GE to found my own startup, I made a big mistake, and I made two mistakes. One mistake was that when everybody was raising money by, writing a little note on a used, tissue, it was that simple back in those days. I didn't, and we funded the startup with cash from operations, and we grew very quickly. But what I didn't realize at the time was that you need a lot more cash the more you grow, and we actually outgrew our cash ability, and it made the business suffer. But the bigger challenge I think I had was that I surrounded myself with very good, very capable leaders. but none of them having a strong enough personality to stand up to me. And I think that was the biggest mistake. And the good news is, the biggest learning for me, you need a team. So whether it's your co-founder or your first hires or eventually your CEO, if you get to that point, they need to be different than you, and you need to be able to listen to them and understand them. So I think that's where startups are different, because you can really, if you think through it, can plan from that. Whereas a big corporation that has 20 or 100 years under their belt and 20,000 or 100,000 employees, that ship has sailed. So you need to kind of go in and act differently and navigate in a different way.
Thanks, Farley. That's really incredible insight. I'm just a bit conscious of time, so I really have two more questions before we wrap this up. One is, I want to move on to the topic of innovation itself. Can you walk us through what innovation means and how it can be used to create value for the economic recovery of Australia, especially through COVID?
Yeah, listen, first of all, I think that innovation for innovation's sake is the wrong way to go. So, I mean, it's neat, and it's, in science, it's really important. In academics, it's extremely important. But when it comes down to a business that has shareholders and stakeholders and customers, you should be innovating in order to provide a new return. It could be a new product. It could be a safer product. It could be a safer process. But something that really shakes things up, that does things differently. To me, that's what innovation is. It's busting the status quo in order to make a step change. Innovation, I guess, could be an evolutionary change, but I think of innovation more as a revolutionary change, something that, goes above and beyond. So to me, that's what innovation is. And I think all companies, even the most, stable, long-term companies producing the most simple product, need to innovate. They might need to innovate less than technology companies, but they still need to innovate. Otherwise, time will take them over and they won't succeed. And it's so important that when you're thinking about change and when you're thinking about innovation and you're thinking about challenging the culture and the status quo, that you always base it on a return, always on what is the impact that is going to provide the bang for the shareholder, the stakeholder, for the customers, and for the employees.
That's amazing. Farley, thank you so much for your time, for the chat, and for sharing your amazing insights. It was really great speaking to you.
Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. It looks like there's a couple questions that have come in over the chat or Q&A session. So I'll start with the first one, and please feel free to ask anything you like. CB asks, how important is government support in regards to innovation for Australia, especially in relation to the ecosystem, to the environment, economic recovery? So I'll start off by saying that, YBF is an ecosystem player. We really believe that it is not one individual or one company or one subset of the economy that creates innovation. It's actually something that a magic occurs when everybody works together. Government certainly plays a big role. They do a couple things. Certainly in this economic recovery that we need now, they need to free up capital. They need to get folks back to work. And they need to, as importantly, provide the space for innovation to happen. But innovation can't happen with only government. It requires small businesses and large businesses. It requires leadership. It requires higher education and the like. So, I think we're seeing some really good things happen in Australia. I think we're seeing a large and diverse group of folks come together from government, from business, from higher ed. And that needs to continue more than ever. 2021 will be about rebuilding, and I look at 2022 as reaping the rewards of all the innovation that will come out of COVID. So certainly a big role, but not the sole role. We've got a second question from JH. The question is, if a company doesn't have a culture of innovation and are unsure how to begin that process, what would you recommend they do? Yeah, listen, I think a lot of companies don't have innovation, and a lot of companies do. So it really depends where you are. The older the company, the more simple the product, the less innovative they've had to be in history. So it's likely that they're going to be less innovative going forward unless there's an intervention made. Typically, it starts with leadership. It starts with, if not that innovation coming from the leadership that's in place specifically, is at least having that leadership provide the space, acknowledge that there's a problem. So one of the analogies I use, if an alcoholic doesn't admit that he or she has a problem, they're likely not to address it. So one of the first things that a company needs to do is acknowledge that there's a problem, or said more positively, there's an opportunity to do things differently and better. Secondly, you need someone that is willing to step up and innovate. And I mentioned it earlier, is you need someone that has a risk profile to take those virtual punches to the gut or black eyes, because innovation is hard. It's tough. You're asking people to change something that they've done all along. So really, to recap it, it's two things. It's, the leadership of the company at a minimum providing space, and hopefully providing more than space and actually putting the systems and processes and people in place to drive innovation. And then it's an innovative leader, whether that's at the top or somewhere else, that has a risk profile to go after it. Another question came in from MM. Where do you see management consulting companies needing to innovate most? Management consulting companies are not just, I would say, one homogenous group. There's management consulting companies of all varieties. Some are very specialized, some are very generic. But I think, the important thing is to really put themselves in the shoes of the customer, really understand what the customer needs, bring the expertise that they have around what is happening environmentally, what is happening with their competitors or their comparator organizations, but allowing those companies to succeed. And it's a tough one. The management consulting model, to oversimplify, is made up of continuing to get more and more work from the same company. And that's great. And it's necessary in a lot of cases. But until the customer takes ownership for innovation, in order to actually own what they're doing and to deliver it, they won't fully challenge the status quo, and they won't build a sustainable culture of innovation. And I think management consulting can help, but they need to think through the business model on how they can help hand over the reins, at the same time secure ongoing work in new and interesting ways. So they need to be innovative in their approach to their customer, and they need to be innovative in their solutions. I'm just looking at the screen. There are no more questions at this point. We'll wait probably a minute longer or so. Otherwise, I think we can probably call it a wrap, with 2 minutes to spare for everybody to run and take a bio break or something.